Thanks for having me. I'm not sure if you can see me, but over COVID, I wiped my screen too much with, I think what I wasn't supposed to sanitize it. Now I've lost like sort of my screen, and my Apple Care just ran out last week. So I'll do, hopefully everyone can see me. But I wanted to thank you, Ian. That was a great presentation. And, it leads a little bit into what I want to talk about. I want to spend just a few minutes talking about manufacturing in particular, especially now as we look at, the importance of climate change, the climate crisis, why we need green technology, why we need electric vehicles, but the importance, as Congresswoman Dingell pointed out, how we do that in a way that it's possible to do both, to change to electric vehicles while at the same time having sustainable jobs. But first, we have to understand where we're at in auto. I know Bob's on the phone, so anytime you want to jump in, Bob, just feel free. But right now, what a lot of people don't realize, and it's been happening over years, you always hear manufacturing is a good job, right? Whenever companies are looking for subsidies or coming into Michigan, it's, manufacturing is going to create the middle class, right? So they're always, using that as they get millions of dollars in tax dollars. But the truth is, manufacturing in and of itself is not a good job unless there's a union in the workplace. In fact, what we find, 80% of the vehicles is made in the parts sector, right? And so in that sector where the majority of the vehicles being produced, workers are making 10, 11, $12 an hour. They're literally working full time, walking into food stamp lines and then getting vilified by others, on the right or in Congress. Yet companies are making tons of money. Workers are more productive. Wages are low. So unless there's a union, it's just a fallacy that manufacturing will create the middle class or recreate it, like you often hear. That's even more important now because you're hearing that more and more as companies are looking to electrification. Right now, just an example, I think people don't realize even in Michigan, and often sometimes I wake up every morning and go to bed. In the UAW, I have the Stellantis department, which is formerly FCA and Chrysler. I have organizing, and I have all the parts workers. Those are my assignments. So I go to sleep, I wake up, and all day long, I think there's 14 car companies building cars in the United States. 3 of them are union. So think about that. 3 are union, 11 are non-union. And a part of what Ian was talking about is density. The more density you have, the more power you have to set a standard. So while we are continuing to get good contracts in Ford, GM, and Chrysler, how long will that last, right? How long will we be able to set that? I would say we're no longer really setting the standard. If you look at what happened during the auto crisis, you'll remember there was a lot of talk that the UAW wages and the workers made the companies uncompetitive, right? That sort of was the narrative that got out there. Totally false, right? It was what was happening on Wall Street, the housing crisis. But, the government came to the UAW and said, you need to go down to what Toyota, Honda, all these non-union companies are making. Instead, it should have been, no, they need to come up to UAW workers, because the problem in the country wasn't that workers were making 30 some dollars an hour, that they had a pension that they could retire on with dignity or healthcare. Well, but we didn't do that. But now we have the time to do that. When you look at some of the things that's happening as you read the news, and GM, for example, is doing these joint ventures, and you hear Mary Barra say, of course we want a union, right? Or it shouldn't even say that strong. She says more, we want a union, but it's up to the workers, right? Or you will hear, Ford say the same thing. And when we get into the PRO Act, I want to talk a little bit about that, because that's really a tactic to make sure they stay non-union, right? You hear companies often say, we'd appreciate a union, but it's up to the workers, because what they know is that they'll help form anti-union committees of workers, and then they can step back and say, the workers don't want it, right? Even though we know that they've spent a lot of money to create those kinds of committees. And so it's going to be really important during this transition. How do we drive a wage? If engines are going to be replaced by batteries, how do we make sure that those workers are going to make the same amount of money as these companies get subsidized? And it's important for people to understand, because they're going to make this competitive argument again, right? They're going to say, we can't be competitive, so battery workers need to make $16 an hour. That's sort of the rate right now that you hear a lot. So workers who are building engines are making, upwards of, over 30, they progress. And then, they're saying 16. And they're really smart about that. What people don't understand is the problem with electrification right now is that the batteries cost about $8,000. It's a problem. The companies can't figure out how they use that battery and be able to sell, vehicles. The cost is too high, but the cost isn't in labor cost. The cost is in the materials of the battery. That's why they need to be subsidized. A very small part is how much it costs to pay a worker to build a battery. It's materials. So for example, in Germany that you talked about, Ian, they're looking at, there's not even a debate right now, maybe it'll happen, but it's not right now. There's the assumption that an engine is no longer going to be made. So a battery is going to take the place. Workers will make the same amount as they're making now. Because they know labor cost isn't the issue, it's the materials. And so, we have a big, fight in front of us, because all companies are saying the right thing as they look to go into the administration and how do they subsidize this electrification. But what they're not doing is they're not talking to the union about a fair process to make sure that those jobs are the jobs that UAW workers, for example, or steel workers, or what they've spent decades trying to build. And you'll see, the code they use. And if you look in the paper that they're constantly using, it's up to the workers. You have Elon Musk out there right now, basically saying that, the UAW workers they don't understand electrification, even though we've been building electric vehicles long before Elon Musk came along. We have some companies who are completely honest, like Tesla, they don't like the union, they say it and they fight it. And then you have others that are supposed friends who, use code, know exactly what their strategy is, or making joint ventures instead of bringing them into the assembly plant. So it's a huge fight that I hope as we engage in this, and we're working a lot right now with environmental groups and others, because, one thing that's really clear, we all believe that there's a climate crisis. We all believe that we need to have this transition to electric vehicles. The UAW, and most of the workers understand that. You might hear some workers say that, the UAW has to stop this, but pretty much our workers are very smart and intelligent. They know that there's a climate crisis. They know that there's a global chain. They just want to be a part of making sure that those are good jobs. So where do we go from here? Part of it is the PRO Act, right? The PRO Act is a fair system, and you're going to hear about that a little bit more from Kate, but it isn't going to be what gets us there all the way, right? I rather see an auto, we just strike for recognition. That is another alternative to form a union versus having to go to a board election, but it will help. But that still takes a lot of time. And once we get the PRO Act, there's still going to be companies who, break the law, who we are going to have to take to court to prove that they do. So it's a longer process. Again, I think it's a process we need to have, but it doesn't fix our problems. And it certainly doesn't fix the problem of wages and creating a standard. Again, if you go back to, you have 11 companies that are non-union to 3 that are. We need help from the administration, from the public, to make sure that when the UAW sits at the bargaining table in 2023 and sets a standard, how are we going to make sure through sectoral bargaining, for example, we got to think out of the box on how we do this, so that those other companies, even before the workers are able to form a union, are able to have that same kind of standard. So we do take wages out of the equation so that workers can compete on productivity and quality, which our workers are very productive and high quality products. And we need to do this globally too. We are working with, unions in Mexico. We're working with unions in Germany. And how do we do this to make sure that they also don't pit one country against another? And then the other is, how do we start talking as we organize workers? There's a lot of division in this country. How do we in manufacturing start talking about, race and class? We can't just talk that this is an economic crisis. We have a racial crisis in our country, and workers are divided because they're not seeing that they're in this fight together, because the right has been so successful in dividing workers. And so that is work that we're doing currently in the UAW that we're going to continue to do, is how do we bring workers together, remember what they have in common, and not let those with false narratives and dog whistles divide them. So again, I think the PRO Act is one way, but we got to look at sectoral bargaining. We got to look at, and we got to send a strong message, not just the UAW, but everyone in this country. Not a company should get $1 of our tax dollars if they're not willing to have a fair process to workers to form a union. And we have to be really strong in that. And we're going to have to do that on the ground as well as we lobby in the administration. No company right now, General Motors is investing $1 billion in Mexico to have electric vehicles, while at the same time, there's workers there trying to fight off an anti-union campaign. And so, we're going to have to push that. Tax dollars should only go to companies who are willing to have a union, as well as, let me just add one thing, community benefits like we did in Chrysler. It has to be about the broader community when they get a facility too. How does that help them in education and the environment and all of those things? So I think I went on a little bit long. I'm gonna leave it open for questions with that.
Okay, so there, I don't see any questions, Cindy, but I do see some comments in the in the chat. And one comment was from Robert Thomas King, who talked about the German auto companies are global and globally are very competitive. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that when you talk about how you guys are working with other companies, other countries to make this happen.
So part of that, we sit on a global council, industrial, and we work. We have different, different companies have working groups. But what we're trying to make sure is that as product changes to different countries, that we're working with those unions in those countries to make sure that whichever parent company. So, for example, Chrysler, we're working with the French union, Italian unions, and the U.S. unions to make sure if they go anywhere else, that we're working with those trade unions to make sure that they're keeping the standards up. And it's a fight; it's not easy. And in Germany, it's really important. They do have high density. I mean, they're starting to get anti-union campaigns. Like Elon Musk is there right now, refusing to deal with the unions. He's building a battery plant, nobody knows, over a water table that is protected. And so, the anti-union campaigns that we saw here, they're starting to see, and companies that, really don't have an interest. They're interested in their profits and not in having a relationship with workers. So we're working with them in those aspects. But they because of their union density, they have been able to take wages more out of the equation so that workers there can compete on quality and productivity. And it shows you, wages are not the issue, right? If everyone's making the same, right? We don't have a battery industry right now. We could say batteries should be $35 an hour. We're creating what the rate is, as long as everybody follows it, right? So that's and I think a lot of we have to do a better job of explaining to our elected officials, because people just hear that competitive argument, right? And it scares them. So yeah.
You mentioned too, and this is a question for me, you mentioned too that the administration helped to negotiate down the union position in terms of going to the auto companies and saying, we need to, I'm sorry, I'm trying to repeat what you said, but my question is,
we need to be competitive, right? So you have to come down to, we hear that every time at the bargaining table. And I think we're in a different place then. And I think the public, I think elected officials, I think the union are much more understanding of why that isn't appropriate, right? Okay. That we should be saying they need to come up. And Germany and places like that, and Sweden do that, right? They don't let another company come in and undercut their wages. They know the importance of everyone having the same standard. Yet we do that here in the United States, right? And that's why companies are moving to the South, right? They can move to the South and pay a lot less in wages, and because there's a lot less density. And so,
because for companies, the wages is more important than it is employee rights, right?
Yeah, definitely. All of it. I mean, to a company, they just any way they can squeeze out an extra dime to get a profit, right? Even though they're making billions. I mean,
exactly.
CEOs are making 350 times that of the average worker. No one says they shouldn't make a lot of money, but is that necessary as productivity goes up and wages go down?
Exactly. Okay. I'm going to turn it back over to Ian.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just going to add one real quick thing. That table that I showed where France had 90% collective bargaining coverage, what that means is that even though only 11% of workers in France belong to unions, the, the wage bargains that those unions negotiate with their employer under French law, extension laws, get extended to the entire sector. So they use legislation to create sectoral bargaining outcomes that take wages out of competition. So the workers in one or two auto plants that are unionized, that what they negotiate gets extended to the France's entire auto sector. So it's very much in line with what Cindy's talking about. And that's why, you know, looking at collective bargaining coverage is actually a better way of gauging the power of labor, because when you can get those kind of laws, when you can take wages out of competition, you can make major progress in terms of advancing wages in an entire sector of the economy, you know, which gets you around the problem that we face in a place like Amazon. If we organize one plant, what happens? Amazon just closes that plant, you know, even if the organizing drive succeeds.